Hi there, my name is Scott Elzy, and this is my presentation on the Michigan Alcoholism Screening Test, or shortened the MAST. Um, the Michigan Alcoholism Screening Test, or the MAST, is a 22-question screening tool that's used to assess for the level of risk and use of alcohol in people. It was originally 25 questions, but they've since revised it and shortened it to 22 questions. This test uses a dichotomous response scale. In other words, all the answers are yes or no, or like a true-false type statement. There's actually a bunch of variations of this test as well. As you can see at the right, I've placed the scoring sheet for the brief MAST. This one only has 10 questions. There's also a short MAST, which is 13 questions. There's the MAST G, which is specifically for geriatric clients or patients. And I'll get into more on why that's necessary later in the presentation. But there's a variety of kind of permutations of this test that have developed over time as the need arose. The MAST is just one of many different screening tools for alcoholism. There's a few other tests like the CAGE, the SASSY, they all have these fun names, but it's one of the most widely used screening tools for alcoholism. It's also one of the oldest. It was developed in 1971. The populations it's appropriate for, it can be used for most people, but it does lose some effectiveness in testing in geriatric populations. Okay. So some of the positives of the MAST are that it's easy to administer. It can be self-administered, so the client or patient can just take it himself and write down the answers, and then it can be scored by the professional afterwards, or the counselor or professional can just interview the client and do it as they go. It's a very quick test. The whole thing takes maybe 10 minutes. Obviously, the brief test is even quicker, but it's also very quick to score. It's the revised MAST is, like I said, 22 questions, but it's all simple weighted scoring. So you get a point if you get a point for this question, a point for that question, a point for this question, and no points if you answer correctly. So there's not, in other words, there's not like this question's worth 3 points or 2 points, and this one's 1. So it's a little simpler. The brief MAST and actually the original MAST were weighted scoring, where they did have those different weights on different questions. So it's changed a bit over time. Another positive is that it's very effective at detecting alcohol dependence. So that's kind of the point of why it exists, and it does that very well. We'll get into where it struggles in a second, but it's also very simple to understand. The questions make sense for the most part, and you can easily see kind of the progression of use throughout this test. Some of the negatives of the MAST. So there's actually a fair number, but yeah. It's less effective at detecting early stage alcohol abuse or dependence. So while it's very accurate and reliable and valid when looking at someone who has an alcohol problem, like a more severe alcohol problem. It tests very highly for that. It does not test as well when we're talking about someone who's on the edge, someone who's maybe made some bad decisions around alcohol, but is not actually alcoholic. And that's where the test gets a little sketchier. It simultaneously can overdiagnose, and it could underdiagnose. It's very erratic there. So it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's also less effective at detecting alcoholism in geriatrics. So that is why they created a specific MAST version for that population. Some of the items on the questionnaire are pretty ambiguous, and so that is a problem. What the first question on it is: do you drink or drug as much as, going off memory here, as much as as a normal person? And the word is normal person. And so it's just a little confusing, and not everyone sees that the same, and especially an addict or an alcoholic is going to go, yeah, that's normal. That is normal. And so they're going to answer that question all sorts of different ways. And there's a few questions kind of like that. The questions, because it is simple, they're all yes/no answers. There's no room for explanation. So, for example, one of the questions is, have you ever been to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting? That's the question. You get yes or no. And you get a point towards alcoholism if you answer yes. Well, what if you've gone to support a friend? What if you've visited an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting at one of their open meetings just to check it out? So there's a few kind of, you can't explain that. It's just not in the test. Another situation is it relies on the client being honest. If they're self-reporting that, all this stuff, and they're being truly honest with themselves, yeah, it's going to be more accurate. If they're not, it's not going to be accurate. So there's definitely issues with it. Couple of the things that are interesting with this under validity and reliability are, really, after many, many tests, years of study, no difference has been found between the simple scoring and the weighted scoring. So even though an earlier version was weighted scoring and now it's simple scoring, and the brief MAST is still weighted, from what the studies have shown, there's no empirical evidence showing any difference in outcomes. So, which surprised me. That did surprise me. I expected the weighted scoring to be more accurate, but nothing showed that. The MAST shows high sensitivity at 88%, but it had insufficient specificity at 50%, and just kind of a moderate accuracy overall when it comes to classification, 58%. And that kind of underscores the problem of the excessive false positives that it gives. As I said, it can overdiagnose depending on where the person's at in their alcohol use. So there are issues there. Some of my kind of main takeaways from this project, I struggled with understanding a lot of the testing procedures that surrounded the reliability of the brief MAST. When I was looking at the journal articles, I really did struggle with that. I eventually was able to find some of the statistics on reliability and all that, but it was pretty difficult actually for something that's been tested as much as it has. Another thing that I actually learned was I did not know about all these different variations off of the MAST. I knew the MAST had been around for a long time, but I actually didn't know that much about it. I've used it before, but um, really hadn't used. I mean, really didn't know about all the different types, the changes to it, the shifts, the changes for different populations. So that was pretty cool. Um, yeah, so it was actually a very helpful thing for me to actually look at that, because for most of this time I've actually considered it a very poor tool just in general, and didn't like it. Um, but in reality, it's a good tool for what it is. For what it does do, it does that very well. It can detect someone who is alcoholic quite well. It's just dicier when the lower the score, the less accurate it becomes. The higher the score, it's very accurate. So, um, so it's an interesting tool, but I would recommend using a secondary tool alongside it. So maybe using the audit test, the cage test, the SASE. Any of those are also good and will probably cut down on some of the false positives when used in conjunction with the MAST. So here are my references, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me. All right.